The River Cup Cafe sat quietly beside the Mississippi, tucked off a slow road in Baton Rouge. It was little more than a wooden structure with stone foundation, strung with amber lights that cast everything in warm shadow. A handful of tables, dark wood worn smooth by years of use, and the steady sound of water nearby. The air smelled of old leather, river mud, and something darker, cigar smoke that clung to the corners even when no one was smoking. To Marco Vitale, it was exactly what he needed. Every evening he came at the same time to the same corner table, black espresso in hand, a gold lighter he never used sitting beside his cup like a talisman. After years of New York, the kind of business you didn't explain to strangers, the kind of money that moved in briefcases rather than wire transfers, the quiet of this riverside town felt earned, hard-won. His former life had been a whirlwind of cash, handshakes that meant everything, and consequences that couldn't be reversed. He'd walked away before they walked him out. Now he wore dark button-downs instead of tailored suits, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Alongside his old associate Henry, he'd built something different. A small string of riverside cafes, places designed not for profit but for peace. Legitimate fronts that became real. Coffee, not favors. And this was supposed to be another quiet evening until Henry interrupted it. "Someone's coming," Henry said casually, wiping his hands on a towel behind the counter. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. 5:30. Just sit." Marco looked up, his blue eyes sharp beneath dark brows. "I don't do this anymore." "That's why I didn't ask." Henry's expression was unreadable. Just wait, don't run." Marco stayed, out of respect, maybe curiosity. In the background, soft jazz played from an old speaker, the kind of music his father used to hum while counting money at the kitchen table. At exactly 5:30 she arrived. She stepped through the side gate barefoot, hair windblown and golden, falling from a loose ponytail. Her green sundress clung to her calves, streaked with drying mud. One hand held her sandals, the other pushed damp hair from her face. Marco nearly stood to leave. She looked like she'd swum here. What kind of setup was this? Then she looked up, and everything paused. Her hazel eyes locked with his, warm, steady, tired but bright. She smiled, not embarrassed or flustered, just open. "Hi," she said, brushing hair from her cheek. "Sorry for the entrance. I just pulled a kid out of the river. The mud's a bonus." Marco said nothing. Behind him, one of Henry's men shifted positions slightly near the doorway, watching. She dropped her sandals beside the chair and sat across from him like she belonged there. The air shifted, warm, unscripted, honest in a way Marco hadn't encountered in years. "The river," he said finally, his voice low. "You went in?" She nodded, wringing water from the hem of her dress with ease. "She slipped off a rock. I was nearby with my dog. It was either jump or watch her float off." Marco studied her, unsure whether to believe her, but there was no performance in her expression. No angle. "I guess showing up to a blind date looking like I lost a fight with a mudslide doesn't help first impressions," she said, grinning. He let out a quiet breath. He could have left, could have made a polite excuse, but he stayed. Something about the way she said it, the way she was entirely unbothered by the awkwardness, the mess, the way the last light of sunset lit her hair like copper wire. "Clara," she said, reaching across the table. He took her hand. It was damp, a little rough, honest. "Marco." And something settled between them. Not loud, not forced, just there. Quiet, steady, like the river itself had paused to listen. The River Cup Cafe was quieter now. The soft murmur of river wind curled through the open space, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and something darker, earth maybe or memory. Golden light spilled low over the Mississippi, brushing everything in amber and shadow. Marco sat across from her, hands cupped loosely around his espresso, still trying to make sense of this barefoot stranger with riverbank in her hair. "This how you usually arrive?" he asked, voice low but even. Clara laughed, a light sound that somehow made the sunset feel warmer. "Only when I save small children from drowning. Mud's complimentary." He almost smiled. The awkward tension cracked just a little. You said you're a teacher? He asked after a moment. She nodded. First grade, which means I teach the alphabet, tie shoelaces, settle crayon wars, and occasionally serve as backup mom. Marco raised a brow slightly. Sounds exhausting. Only on the days that end in Y, she said, sipping her chamomile tea like it was the world's most normal evening. There was warmth in her tone he hadn't expected. Not just humor, but something else. Like she carried 100 tiny stories and didn't mind if you borrowed one for a while. His gaze dropped almost involuntarily to her bare feet, still dusted with earth, resting easily on the stone floor. You really came straight here after pulling a kid out of the river? He asked. Clara tilted her head, half sheepish, half proud. I did consider running home, changing, brushing the mud out of my eyebrows. Her voice softened. Then I thought if someone's waiting for me, maybe they're worth showing up for, even when I'm not perfect. Marco looked up. The way she said it, light but not casual, landed somewhere deeper than he meant to let it. He nodded once, quietly. There was a pause. So, he said, voice dropping lower, this girl you saved, what was she like? Clara's eyes lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Talkative. The kind of talkative that makes you think the world must revolve around her stories. Bright eyes, pink dress, hair in tight little braids. Marco froze. She called me a river ninja, Clara went on, chuckling. Then asked if I wanted to come to her birthday party next week. Told me there'd be balloons and cupcakes, and that I could bring my own juice if I didn't like apple. His heartbeat stuttered. Wait, he said suddenly, voice more serious. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a small photo, and slid it across the table. Was she wearing something like this? Clara leaned forward. Her fingers hovered for just a second before she picked it up. Yes, she whispered. That's her. That's the girl. She looked up, confused. How do you have her photo? Marco stared at her, stunned. She's my niece, Ellie. She's staying with someone while her parents are overseas. I didn't even know she was near the river today. Clara blinked, still holding the photo gently like it might dissolve. I had no idea. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The river kept moving. A duck flapped noisily near the reeds. Clara set the photo down carefully. Marco watched her hands. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy in a meaningful way, like something had shifted, not just in the conversation, but in the air itself. Clara glanced out at the river. Marco followed her gaze. Neither of them smiled, but their eyes had changed, warmer, deeper, more open. The first espresso sat forgotten between them, growing cold as the light faded. And just like that, the story stopped being about mud and started being about something else entirely. The moment Clara confirmed the girl in the photo was Ellie, something changed in Marco's expression. A flicker of realization, followed almost instantly by tension. He stood up, the movement controlled but sudden. Just a second, he said, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Clara watched as he turned away, shoulders tense, pacing to the edge of the patio that overlooked the river. He dialed, his jaw set. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Finally, the voice of Mark answered, the man who was watching Ellie for the week while her parents were away. Where's Ellie? Marco's voice was tight, controlled. She okay? There was a pause on the other end. Clara sat frozen, her fingers curling around her tea glass. She's fine, Mark replied calmly. Wet, but totally fine. She fell down by the riverbank this afternoon. Gave us a scare, but she was pulled out right away by a woman. Blonde, muddy, like a superhero in yoga pants. Marco let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hand tightened around the phone. You're sure she's not hurt? She's already eaten 2 granola bars and told the story 6 times, Mark said with a chuckle. Your niece is indestructible. Honestly, she keeps talking about the woman who saved her. I think she's in love. Marco let out a quiet laugh, relief crashing through him. He ended the call and returned to the table, sitting back down across from Clara. Slower this time. The sharpness in his eyes had softened into something far more vulnerable. She's okay, he said, almost to himself. Then he looked up at Clara, meeting her gaze directly. She's really okay because of you. Clara gave a small smile, uncertain what to say. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, like she was something essential. Thank you, Marco said. His voice dropped lower, steadier. Not just for this, for her. Clara blinked, caught off guard by the rawness in his tone. She looked down, letting the silence stretch for a moment, letting it say what neither of them could quite articulate. Not long after, headlights pulled up to the cafe's entrance. A familiar silver SUV came to a stop just beyond the patio. "That's them," Marco murmured, standing. The passenger door flew open, and a little girl in a ruffled pink dress jumped down, clutching a well-loved stuffed bear. Her braid bounced as she ran, and the second she saw Marco, she let out a squeal. "Uncle Marco!" Marco knelt, arms open. Ellie crashed into him, hugging him fiercely. Clara stood slowly, brushing her skirt. Then Ellie turned, and her eyes went wide. "You!" she shouted, pointing with utter joy. "You're the river ninja." Clara laughed, crouching to meet her eyelid. "I don't know about ninja, but yes, that was me. Are you okay?" Ellie nodded vigorously, then grew serious. "Did you fall too? 'Cause your dress is super muddy." Clara tapped Ellie's nose gently. "It's part of the superhero costume." Ellie giggled. Marco stood behind her, watching the interaction unfold with a strange fullness in his chest. He had spent years in rooms where power was currency, where loyalty was bought and silence was survival. And yet he couldn't recall the last time his world had felt this complete. Clara rose to her feet, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Marco looked at her, unsure of what to say, then simply followed what felt right. "If you're not in a hurry," he said, voice soft, "would you walk with us for a bit? I think this might be the first date I don't want to end early." Clara looked down at Ellie, who grinned and slipped her hand into Clara's instinctively. She looked up again, met Marco's eyes, and nodded once. "I'd like that." The sun dipped lower over the Mississippi, staining the sky with streaks of apricot and rose. Along the winding path by the riverbank, three silhouettes walked slowly, uneven in height but moving in gentle rhythm. Marco walked with one hand in his pocket, the other resting protectively on Ellie's shoulder. Clara strolled beside them, barefoot still, her sandals dangling from one hand. The hem of her dress was dry now, but the dried mud clung to it like a quiet badge of honor. No one mentioned it anymore. The wind off the river tousled Clara's golden ponytail, and in the glow of the sunset, it looked almost painted, gold leaf against a watercolor sky. Ellie skipped between them, humming a made-up tune, her stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. The little girl had no sense of awkward silence or emotional weight. She simply filled the air with chatter, like she'd known Clara her whole life. "Today at lunch," Ellie announced, "I traded my apples for marshmallows. Mommy says I shouldn't do that, but they were pink." Marco's mouth curved slightly. "Pink marshmallows are hard to resist." Clara grinned. "You're lucky they didn't trade you the green ones. Those are always suspicious." Ellie giggled. Then quite suddenly she turned and asked, "Uncle Marco, can Miss Clara be my private teacher forever?" Marco glanced toward Clara, something unreadable in his expression. "What do you think?" Clara bent down slightly to meet Ellie's eyes and whispered, "If I were your private teacher, I'd have to teach you all sorts of wild things, like how to fall and get back up again." Ellie tilted her head. "Like superhero training?" Clara nodded solemnly. "Exactly like that." They continued walking until they reached an old wooden bench beneath a willow tree, its long branches swaying like whispers. Clara sat first, brushing off a layer of leaves. Marco settled on the other side. Ellie plopped herself in between, legs swinging. A leaf drifted down onto Clara's lap. She picked it up, studying its veins, then began folding it carefully. When she was done, she held out a little heart-shaped leaf, creased with care. "Here," she said, handing it to Ellie. "Whoever keeps this leaf safe until the end of our walk gets to make a wish." Ellie's eyes sparkled. "A real wish?" "A real one," Clara confirmed, tapping her nose. The child held the leaf like it was glass, her small fingers curled protectively around it. As they sat, a woman with a stroller passed by on the path. She slowed for a moment, taking in the three of them, Clara in her muddy dress, Marco in his rolled sleeves, Ellie glowing between them. She smiled, then murmured half to herself, "What a sweet little family." Marco turned his head slightly, caught off guard by the comment. Clara didn't speak, but something in her posture shifted. Marco looked at her, really looked. The light filtered through the willow branches and danced across her face. She had a small smear of dried mud on her temple, and still she looked radiant, not because of perfection, but because of presence. His chest ached, not with sadness, but with something warmer, something unfamiliar, like stepping inside after too long in the cold. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, but their eyes met for a second too long, and that was enough. The sky deepened into a shade of lavender as they made their way back toward the cafe. Ellie walked ahead, but only a few steps, just far enough to let her arms stretch away, holding a hand in each of hers. Marco on one side, Clara on the other. Clara looked down at the little hand in hers, then up. Marco was already watching her. He didn't smile. She didn't either. But in their shared silence, something had shifted. It was not a perfect day. It was a muddy, messy, strangely orchestrated, golden-lit kind of day. And maybe the perfect ones never held anything this real. Since that unexpected walk by the river, something had shifted in Marco's carefully ordered world. Clara had become more than the girl who showed up to a blind date covered in mud. She was now part of his afternoons, part of Ellie's laughter, and part of a slow but certain rhythm returning to his life. There were morning coffees, sometimes at the River Cup, sometimes in takeaway cups as they walked Ellie to day camp. There were texts exchanged late at night, silly dog memes, questions about coffee beans, and quiet admissions about books that made them creeping. Clara never asked about his past in New York. Marco never asked why she always hesitated when someone mentioned home. But in that space of unspoken understanding, something tender began to grow. Until the past came knocking. It was a Wednesday night. Marco had agreed to meet an old associate at a quiet bar on the edge of downtown, someone floating the idea of bringing him back into certain circles, the kind of business that paid well but cost more. He wasn't interested, but respect demanded he listen. The bar was dim, all leather booths and soft jazz. He was halfway through a glass of aged bourbon when a familiar voice sliced through the hum. Well, well, Marco Vitale, still playing the humble cafe owner. He turned. Veronica. His ex-wife hadn't changed much. Designer heels, perfectly sculpted hair, and a gaze that could cut through steel. She slid into the seat across from him without asking. Imagine my surprise, she said, pulling out her phone. When someone sent me this. She turned the screen. A photo taken near the cafe. Marco in rolled sleeves leaning toward Clara, who was laughing, barefoot, hair tied back with a pencil. Ellie stood between them, holding both their hands. Veronica raised a brow. Tell me, is this your new image, reformed family man? Or have you actually fallen for a barefoot elementary school teacher? Marco didn't answer. He didn't owe her anything. You always did have a thing for charity cases, she added with a smirk. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of New Orleans, Clara stood frozen in a bookstore aisle. Clara, she turned. Evan. He looked almost the same. Sharp suit, polished shoes, the same cologne that used to linger on her pillows. Now a rising star in a major law firm. I can't believe it's you, he said, stepping closer. Still in Louisiana? Clara nodded, unsure how to reply. Evan wasted no time. I've seen your posts, that little river cafe life. It's sweet. He scoffed lightly. But come on, Clara. You were meant for more. She stiffened. I mean, you were always brilliant, always soft-hearted, sure, but never small. And now I hear you're seeing someone. He paused. A guy who used to run things in New York, lost everything, and brews coffee now. He shook his head. Clara, you deserve someone who can give you more than second chances and sunset dates. His words hit a nerve she didn't want to admit existed. Clara walked out of the bookstore 15 minutes later, heart heavier than when she'd walked in. That night, there was no text from Marco. She didn't send one either. In the days that followed, the air between them thinned, still kind, still warm, but not as easy, not as open. They didn't speak of exes. They didn't talk about ambition or failure. But in the silences, something crept in. Quiet fears, whispered doubts. Marco caught himself second-guessing before texting her. Clara hesitated before laughing too freely. It wasn't distance in miles. It was the kind that builds when you wonder if you're truly seen or just temporarily understood. One evening, they stood together at the back of the cafe, watching Ellie show off a silly dance move with wild abandon. Clara smiled faintly. She's going to break hearts someday. Marco nodded but didn't speak. Clara looked up at him, waiting. But Marco only sipped his espresso, eyes unreadable. And that was when Clara knew something from the past had returned. Not a person, not a mistake, but the quiet fear that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't meant to last. Not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much and didn't know how to say it. The days that followed moved slowly, like the river after rain. Marco sat alone one evening in the back office of the River Cup Cafe. The glow of a single desk lamp cast long shadows across papers he hadn't touched. In front of him was a letter, an offer to return to New York. Not the old business, but something adjacent. Consulting work for people who valued his experience. The kind of work that paid in cash and asked few questions. But the note scribbled at the bottom of the final page made his hand still. We trust you'll maintain a clean profile. No controversies, no reputational risks. It wasn't subtle. He reread the words, then stared out the window at the soft ripple of the Mississippi. Somewhere out there, Clara might have been walking home from school, or sitting with Ellie, helping her glue paper leaves onto a drawing. He wondered what she would say if she saw that sentence. He wondered if she'd already guessed. Across town, Clara stood frozen in the kitchen of her small apartment, holding a letter she'd just opened. It bore the seal of a university in Vermont. Accepted. A full-year fellowship in children's graphic storytelling. Everything she'd dreamed about in college. A rare opportunity. Tuition covered, studio space provided, a mentor whose books she'd once hidden in the back of her classroom for rainy days. Her fingers trembled. But the deadline for enrollment was 10 days away. And Ellie, sweet bright Ellie, had just drawn her first ever real comic strip. It was a stick figure adventure featuring herself, Clara, and a dragon made of books. She'd shown it proudly after dinner the night before, saying, "Maybe you and me can make one together." Clara swallowed hard. How could she vanish just when the little girl had started seeing her as something permanent? That Friday, rain fell steadily, soft and endless, soaking the sidewalks and turning the cafe's stone patio into a mirror of the sky. Clara came anyway. She wore her favorite sweater, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, hair tucked beneath a hood. The world smelled of wet leaves and brewing coffee. But Marco was not there. Instead, one of the young baristas spotted her at the entrance and approached with a small envelope. Marco said, "If you came, I should give you this." Clara's heart skipped. She took the envelope, hands damp from rain. Inside was a single folded drawing, clearly in Ellie's cheerful handwriting. Crayon colors spilled across the paper. The picture showed Ellie between Clara and Marco, each of them holding one of her hands. Behind the sketch, in Marco's handwriting, were just a few lines. If you care about someone enough, you don't ask them to choose. You learn to wait until they're ready to reach for you again. Clara read it once, then again. She sat down at the corner table where they'd once shared a quiet conversation about mud and rivers and second chances. Outside, thunder rumbled gently. People came and went, shaking off umbrellas and raincoats, ordering hot drinks to warm their palms. Clara stayed. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She didn't count. At some point, the barista brought her tea without asking. She nodded a thank you, voice caught somewhere in her throat. She traced the lines of Ellie's drawing with one finger, her lips pressed tightly together. This wasn't heartbreak, not really. It was something softer. The ache of timing, of silence too long between words, of wanting to reach but not knowing how. Rain tapped gently at the awning, and in that space of unsaid things, Clara waited, not for an answer, but for the courage to choose what would come next. Marco stood on the back patio of the River Cup, morning light stretching over the cypress trees. Fog clung to the river below like breath on glass. His espresso sat untouched, cooling in his hand. He had made his decision. The offer from New York remained unopened on his desk. Good money. Connections. A return to the life he once knew. But none of it tempted him. Not after these past few weeks. Not after Clara. "I traded everything once," he'd told Henry over drinks. "Cost me too much. I won't pay it again." Later that morning, Marco walked to Clara's apartment. The building manager recognized him. She left earlier today, he said. Big suitcase. Told me to give you this. A cream envelope, smudged faintly with charcoal. No name on the front. Marco opened it by the stairwell, river breeze curling at its corners. Inside, her handwriting. Marco, I'm not leaving because I'm hurt. I'm leaving because I need to be someone who can stand without being held. I want to know who I am outside of falling in love. If you're still by the river when the leaves turn, I promise I'll come back with my first book and something worth offering. Clara. He exhaled slowly, folded the letter, tucked it into his jacket, and walked away. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to the hush of early fall. The mornings cooled, leaves turned gold. The river quieted. Marco found a rhythm. He walked Ellie to and from art camp. They brewed hot tea in the afternoons. He taught her to steep, not rush. She repeated his advice like scripture, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth. Each evening he sat by the river with a cup, watching the sky shift colors like water running off a brush. He didn't chase. He didn't forget. On his fridge, Ellie's drawing remained, the three of them, hand in hand. Now and then, between spoonfuls of cereal, she'd ask, "You think Miss Clara's drawing her book?" Marco would nod. "I hope so." Then one quiet Monday in October, a package arrived at the River Cup Cafe. No return address, just plain brown paper sealed with wax in the shape of a falling leaf. Inside, details, always inside. A manuscript. The Muddy Dress Girl and the Boy by the River by Clara B. He sat down on the patio where they first met. His heart beat slowly but loud. The pages smelled like pencil, ink, and late nights. The illustrations were warm, simple, full of feeling. Each scene held pieces of the story they'd lived, drawn by someone who had learned to leave and still return. On the last page, a sketch of three figures walking toward the riverbank. Beneath it, in Clara's handwriting, some journeys begin not when you arrive, but when you decide to come back. Marco ran his finger over the words. Then he looked toward the willow by the water and waited. Marco buttoned the cuffs of his dark shirt slowly, smoothing the fabric before tucking it neatly into his slacks. It was the same shirt he'd worn the first time he sat at the River Cup Cafe, waiting for a date he'd nearly walked out on, until a barefoot woman in a muddy dress smiled at him like the world had never broken her. Ellie skipped beside him as they walked along the familiar river path, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows. She wore her usual pink dress and carried her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She glanced up at Marco with wide eyes. "Do you think she'll really come back?" Marco didn't answer right away. His throat was tight. Instead, he offered her a soft look and squeezed her hand gently. "Let's just wait." They arrived at the Toim, now closed for the evening, its patio chairs stacked, the river breeze rustling through the trees. The willow tree nearby swayed lazily, its branches dancing like ribbons. And then she appeared. Clara stepped out from behind the willow, her golden hair tied back loosely, a soft smile on her lips. She wore a pale blue sundress, and in her hands she held a small wooden box. Ellie gasped and let go of Marco's hand, running toward her. "Miss Clara!" Clara knelt just in time to catch the little girl in her arms, laughing as Ellie wrapped her in a hug. Marco stood still for a moment, unable to speak, his eyes locked with Clara's as she rose. And for a heartbeat, it was just the two of them. No time, no expectations. Only that same quiet recognition that had begun the moment he first saw her eyes. "You still have the heart-shaped leaf?" he asked softly. Clara smiled. She opened the wooden box. Inside, between two delicate sheets of sketch paper, was the dried, golden brown leaf, carefully pressed, its shape still perfect. "And this," she said, reaching in again, "is the wish I made." She unfolded a small drawing. Three figures walking along the riverbank. A man, a woman, and a little girl in a pink dress, all holding hands. Below the illustration, in Clara's neat handwriting, were the words, "I wish we don't miss each other." Marco stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he reached out and gently took her hand. "You didn't miss me," he said quietly. "You came back." The cafe reopened a week later for a special event. Guests wandered between tables and easels, admiring the soft watercolor illustrations of Clara's debut children's book. The Muddy Dress Girl and the Boy by the River. Kids giggled as they traced the outlines of Clara's playful characters, while parents lingered near the counter where Marco stood, pouring coffee with steady hands. Ellie stood in front of the red ribbon, scissors in hand. Clara stood beside her, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Ready?" Marco called from behind the counter. Ellie nodded proudly and snipped the ribbon in one clean cut. The small crowd applauded, and Clara turned toward Marco, her eyes glistening. He lifted a cup toward her in quiet salute. On the brick wall behind the main display, framed in simple wood, was the first sketch Clara ever drew for the book. A girl with messy hair, a muddy dress, and a radiant smile standing in the golden wash of sunset. Beneath it, in tiny letters, was the final line of her dedication. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with promises or perfect timing. It shows up muddy, breathless, and smiling, because someone chose to stay just for the way you looked at them.